Harold Fenner died in March of 1978 with 2 sons and 320 acres of Darke County, Ohio farmland that he had spent 41 years assembling from the original 80 his own father had left him in 1937. He had built the operation carefully and without drama, the way men of his generation built things, through the patient accumulation of adjacent parcels bought when the owners were ready and the account could support it, through the maintenance of equipment that other men would have replaced, through the specific discipline of spending from what the land produced rather than from what the bank would lend against it. He had never lost a piece of ground he had bought. He had never been late on a payment he had made. He had farmed the Darke County soil the way his father had farmed it and the way he intended his sons to farm it after him. The will divided the 320 acres equally, 160 acres to the older son, Walter, 160 acres to the younger son, Dennis. The division was geographic rather than arbitrary. Harold had spent the last 2 years of his farming life thinking carefully about how the split would work, which parcels would go together, which fields adjoined and which were separated by road sections, and the division he arrived at gave each son a contiguous, workable operation, rather than a patchwork that would have made farming both halves difficult. It was a thoughtful division, the product of a man who had understood his land precisely and who wanted the division to be fair in the practical sense, rather than merely in the legal one. He had also spent those 2 years talking to both sons about what he had learned across 41 years of farming Darke County ground. He had talked to them individually, in the kitchen in the evenings, with the kind of specificity that men of his generation brought to practical instruction, not general principles, but specific observations about specific fields, specific soils, specific implements, specific decisions that had worked and specific decisions that had not. He had told them about the drainage problem on the northwest corner of the Hargrove parcel that required attention every 3rd spring when the wet years came. He had told them about the tile that ran under the south field and that required inspection after any significant equipment crossing. He had told them about the machinery dealer in Greenville who was honest and the one in Bradford who was less so. He had told them at some length about the equipment fund, the separate accounting category that he had maintained for 30 years to ensure that the farm's machinery was always bought from income and never from debt, and about how the fund had been the difference between the Fenner operation and the operations around them that had struggled in the lean years because their equipment was mortgaged, and the mortgage payment was due regardless of what the commodity prices did. Walter had listened to all of this. Walter was the older son, 38 years old when Harold died, and he had been working in the farm operation since he was a teenager, and had been doing so more fully since Harold's health began declining in 1975. He had the working knowledge of the land, the specific embodied knowledge that comes from driving across it in every season for 20 years, from feeling the ground change under the implement, from watching the drainage patterns and the crop emergence and the harvest yield maps accumulate across decades into a picture of what the land was and what it needed. He had this knowledge in the way that you have things that have been built from experience rather than learned from description. Dennis had also listened to all of this. Dennis was the younger son, 34 years old when Harold died, and he had grown up on the farm and had worked it in the summers of his teenage years, but had left the county at 22 to take an engineering position in Dayton that had become a career, and while the career had been successful in its own terms, it had also been 20 years away from the land, 20 years during which the working knowledge that Walter had continued building had not been available for Dennis to build. He knew the land in the way that someone knows a language they spoke fluently as a child and then did not speak for 20 years. The structure was there, the general vocabulary was there, but the fluency was not, and fluency was what farming required. This was the difference Harold had not fully known how to address. He had talked to both sons as if the knowledge would transmit through conversation, which was partly true and partly not. The knowledge of principles, spend from income, not from debt, maintain what you have, know your soil before you listen to anyone who doesn't, transferred well through conversation. The knowledge of practice, how the northwest corner drained, where the tile ran, what the south field felt like in a wet spring versus a dry one, transferred less well to a son who had not felt it for 20 years. Harold had worried about this privately. He had not said anything about it to either son in a way that made the worry explicit, because making it explicit would have required acknowledging that he was more confident in one son's ability to manage the inheritance than in the other's, and that was not something he was willing to say in a way that would damage the relationship between the two brothers after he was gone. He had hoped that Dennis would ask Walter for help, or that Walter would offer it, and that the natural collaboration of two brothers farming adjacent land would provide what Harold's conversations alone could not. This did not happen, and the reason it did not happen was not a failure of affection between the brothers. They liked each other well enough, but a failure of the specific kind of confidence that is required to ask for help from someone you are trying to demonstrate your own competence to. Dennis was a capable engineer who had been successful in his career on the basis of his own ability, and arriving at the farm operation with the intention of demonstrating that he could manage it without his older brother's guidance was not a character failure. It was a recognizable human thing, the desire to prove yourself in a situation that you are not sure you are prepared for. He had hired the consultant in the spring of 1978, 6 weeks after Harold's funeral. The consulting firm was an agricultural management company based in Columbus that had been expanding its business into the farm country of west-central Ohio through the late 1970s on the basis of a pitch that was, in the context of the time, genuinely credible. Commodity prices were high, land values were rising, agricultural expansion through leveraged acquisition was producing strong returns for operations willing to capitalize on the favorable lending environment, and professional management, of the kind that corporate agricultural entities employed, was now available to individual farm operations that wanted to grow strategically rather than incrementally. The pitch was not dishonest. The favorable lending environment and the commodity prices were real. The question was whether the favorable conditions would continue long enough for the leveraged expansion to pay for itself before the conditions changed. The consultant's name was Merrill, and he was 35 years old and had an agricultural business degree from Ohio State and a manner that communicated competence and forward thinking that was appealing to someone in Dennis's position. A man who was out of his operational depth and who needed to believe that the professional framework could substitute for the experiential knowledge he did not have. Merrill conducted what he called a farm assessment, which involved a visit to the property, a review of the soil maps and the drainage records, a conversation about the operation's history and its current productive capacity, and the production of a typed report with recommendations that Dennis received 3 weeks after the assessment visit. The report recommended expanding the operation. The logic was straightforward in the language of the time. 160 acres was a suboptimal size for a modern Darke County row crop operation, given the equipment scale that maximized efficiency. The land adjacent to Dennis's parcel, the Van Buren ground to the east, which was being farmed by a man in his late 60s who had been discussing retirement at the elevator, was available at a price that the current land market supported, and that a standard agricultural note would finance. Adding the Van Buren ground would bring the operation to 240 acres, at which point the equipment scale would shift, and the per-acre production cost would decline because the fixed cost of larger equipment would be spread across more acres. The report included projected cash flows under the expansion scenario. The projections used commodity price assumptions based on the 1977 and 1978 market, which were favorable years, and used interest rate assumptions that were below the rates that were, by the time the report was delivered, already beginning to move in the direction that would become the catastrophic interest rate environment of the early 1980s. Dennis had read the report carefully. He had called Merrill with questions. Merrill had answered the questions with the confidence of someone who was selling a recommendation and who believed in the recommendation because the favorable conditions that supported it were the conditions he had been trained to analyze. Dennis had also, at Merrill's suggestion, attended a farm management seminar in Columbus that spring that had reinforced the same general direction: scale up, professionalize, leverage the favorable lending environment before the window closes. He had signed the note for the Van Buren ground in the fall of 1978. 240 acres. Equipment scaled up to match. A new tractor financed through the dealer. The old equipment his father had left him sold to partly fund the down payment on the new machine. The overall position, a significant departure from the debt-free equipment fund model that Harold had spent 41 years building. Walter had watched all of this from the adjacent 160 acres without saying anything that would have been welcome. He had tried to say something once in the late spring of 1978, before the Van Buren note was signed. He had driven over to Dennis's house on a Saturday morning and had sat at Dennis's kitchen table and had said carefully that he had some concerns about the expansion direction and that he wanted to share them if Dennis was willing to hear them. Dennis had said he was willing to hear them. Walter had said Dad's approach was never to borrow to expand. He had always bought land from income, and the equipment fund meant the equipment was always paid for. The current expansion plan involved both a land note and an equipment note, which was a different financial structure than anything Dad had run, and Walter wanted to know whether Dennis had thought carefully about what happened to that structure if the commodity prices came down or the interest rates went up. Dennis had said the consultant had modeled various scenarios and the projections held across a reasonable range of price and rate variation. Walter had said he would like to see the projections. Dennis had said he'd prefer to handle the business side himself. The conversation had ended there. Walter had driven back to his own operation. He had not raised the subject again because the raising of it once had been the right thing to do, and the raising of it a second time would have been something else. An intrusion, a statement of fraternal superiority that Dennis had not invited, and that would have damaged the relationship without changing the decision. Dennis signed the Van Buren note in the fall of 1978. Walter, that same fall, had a conversation with his father's equipment at the Fenner farm. Not a conversation in the literal sense, but the specific and practical assessment that he applied to everything Harold had left him. What was the condition? What did it need? What was the most cost-effective path to keeping it working? Harold had left him equipment that was older than most of his neighbors were running, a 1967 Oliver 1855 diesel that Harold had bought used in 1971, and that had been the operation's primary tractor for 7 years, a set of implements of similar vintage, a grain handling system that had been built in pieces across the 1960s, and that worked correctly because Harold had maintained it with the same attention he applied to everything mechanical. Walter had worked alongside his father on this equipment for years. He knew the 1855's specific characteristics, the injection timing that Harold had adjusted slightly lean for the fuel efficiency advantage, the hydraulic system that required a specific sequence of operations on cold mornings to build pressure without cavitating the pump, the clutch adjustment that needed attention each spring, and that, if caught in time, was a 2-hour job, and if not caught in time, was a 12-hour job. He knew these things the way he knew the northwest corner drainage problem and the tile under the south field, from years of presence and attention. He kept the equipment. He put the equipment fund in a separate account at the Darke County Savings Bank, the way Harold had kept it, funded with the proportion of crop income that Harold had told him to put there, and not to touch for anything except equipment. He farmed the 160 acres the way Harold had farmed them, without the scale and without the leverage and without the professional management that Dennis had retained. The neighbors who farmed adjacent to both brothers in the late 1970s and early 1980s observed the contrast between the two operations with the specific attention of people who are watching a natural experiment unfold in real time. On one side, Dennis's operation, growing from 160 to 240 acres, running newer equipment, professionally managed in the sense that a Columbus consultant was providing quarterly reports and strategic recommendations. On the other side, Walter's operation, unchanged from what Harold had left him, the older equipment maintained and working, no notes, the 160 acres producing at the yield level that Harold's soil management had built over 40 years. The contrast did not look unfavorable to Dennis in 1978 or in 1979 or in most of 1980. The Van Buren ground was producing. The commodity prices, while not quite as favorable as the 1977-1978 peak, were supporting the note payments. The larger equipment was covering the increased acreage efficiently. Merrill's quarterly reports were positive. The interest rates began moving seriously in 1979 and had reached levels by 1981 that were catastrophic for anyone who had borrowed at the rate assumptions of 1978. The commodity prices began softening in 1980 and continued softening through 1981 and 1982. The combination, higher cost of carrying the debt, lower income from the production, was the specific mechanism that the farm crisis of the early 1980s would activate for thousands of operations that had structured themselves on the premise that the favorable late 1970s conditions would continue. Dennis's operation felt it beginning in 1980. The note payments were a fixed obligation that the reduced commodity income was increasingly unable to service without drawing on reserves that were supposed to be operating capital. He had called Merrill. Merrill had said the situation was challenging but manageable and had recommended a refinancing at a longer term to reduce the monthly payment, which would extend the debt service but reduce the immediate pressure on cash flow. Dennis had refinanced. The longer term reduced the monthly payment and extended the period during which the farm's cash flow would be obligated to the bank rather than available for the operation or for the family. The refinancing had bought time. It had not changed the underlying condition, which was an operation whose income at the current commodity prices was below the cost of carrying the debt at the current interest rates. He had called Walter in the late summer of 1981, not to ask for advice. The call was about a piece of equipment that Walter had offered to lend for the harvest, and during the call had mentioned, without dwelling on it, that the operation was in a difficult period. Walter had said he understood and had meant it without judgment. He had not said anything about the conversation from 1978, because saying it would have been cruel and would have served no purpose. The decision had been made, the consequence was arriving, and the only question that mattered now was what Dennis could do about it. What Dennis could do about it was limited by the specific shape of the hole he was in, which was a hole that the refinancing had deepened by extending the term. He had met with the bank in early 1982. The agricultural lending officer, a careful man who had been watching the farm crisis develop across his portfolio for 2 years, had said the bank was willing to work with him on the terms, but that the collateral position needed to be addressed, which was a professional way of saying that the current land values in Darke County, which had fallen significantly from the 1978 peak at which the Van Buren note had been written, were such that the bank's collateral coverage was below the standard. The institution needed to maintain. Addressing the collateral position meant either additional collateral, a principal reduction, or a reduction in the land under the note, which meant selling some of the land to reduce the debt. The Van Buren ground, bought in 1978 at the peak, was worth less in 1982 than it had cost. Selling it at 1982 prices would produce a loss that still left a remaining debt balance after the sale proceeds were applied. Dennis had called Merrill. Merrill had said the situation was difficult and that the options were limited, and that he thought the best path forward was to try to restructure with the bank in a way that preserved as much of the land base as possible. He had offered to assist with the restructuring negotiation at his standard consulting rate. Dennis had said he needed to think about it. He had driven to Walter's farm that evening. It was a Tuesday in February of 1982, cold and clear, and Walter was in the equipment barn doing the winter maintenance on the 1855. The same machine Harold had bought used in 1971, now 11 years in the Fenner operation and working as correctly as it had ever worked, because it had been maintained with the attention Harold had taught, and Walter had continued. The barn was warm from the work light and from Walter's presence in it, and Dennis had sat on an overturned bucket and had watched his brother work for a few minutes before he said anything. He said, "I need to talk to you about the operation." Walter had set down the wrench he was holding. He had looked at his brother. He had said, "Tell me what's happening." Dennis had told him, all of it, from the Van Buren note forward, the refinancing, the interest rate squeeze, the commodity price softening, the bank conversation about the collateral, Merrill's offer to assist with the restructuring at his standard rate. He had told it without self-pity and without evasion, the way that a man in his late 30s tells a serious problem to his brother when he has arrived at the point where the problem is beyond what he can manage by himself and where the pride of managing it alone has become less important than actually managing it. Walter listened without interruption. When Dennis finished, Walter was quiet for a moment. He said, "What does the bank need to see to restructure without a forced sale?" Dennis said the bank needed the collateral position covered, which meant either additional collateral or a principal reduction from cash, neither of which was currently available from the operation itself. Walter said, "What would the principal reduction need to be?" Dennis said he didn't have the exact figure, but the bank's threshold was a specific coverage ratio, and he could calculate the reduction from the current appraised values. Walter said, "Calculate it and come back tomorrow." Dennis calculated it that night. He drove back to Walter's the next morning with the number. Walter looked at it. He said, "That's in range." Dennis asked what he meant. Walter said the equipment fund had a balance that had been building since 1978, and that had not been spent because the 160 acres had not needed new equipment, and because Harold's discipline of not spending the fund for anything other than equipment was the discipline Walter had maintained. He said the balance was not the entire amount the principal reduction required, but it was close, and the difference could be bridged by a note between the two of them, between brothers, at no interest, repayable from farm income at whatever rate the income allowed. Dennis looked at his brother for a moment. He said, "You would do that." Walter said, "You're the only brother I have." He said it without drama. He was not performing generosity. He was stating the logic of the situation as he understood it. Harold had intended both operations to continue, had divided the land equally, had talked to both sons for 2 years before he died about how to keep what he was leaving them. The fact that one son had made decisions the other had not made did not change what Harold had intended, and what Harold had intended was that both farms would continue. Walter would use the equipment fund, the resource Harold had spent 30 years building, to help make Harold's intention possible. The restructuring happened in the spring of 1982. Walter's contribution of the equipment fund balance, combined with the note between the brothers, provided the principal reduction the bank needed to see before approving a restructured term and interest rate that the operation's income could service. The Van Buren ground was not sold. The operation continued. Dennis's farming operation from 1982 forward was a different thing than it had been from 1978 to 1982. The restructuring had imposed a discipline that the original Merrill Consulting engagement had not, a conservative debt service requirement that precluded any further leveraged expansion, a mandatory operating reserve maintained as a covenant of the restructuring agreement, and the practical reality that the operation's cash flow was committed to the restructured note for the next several years. He did not renew the consulting arrangement with Merrill. He drove to Walter's farm instead, not for formal advice, not in the context of business consultations, but in the ordinary way that two brothers who farm adjacent land in the same county drive to each other's farms when something needs discussing or when help with a piece of equipment would be useful, or when the evening is long enough that company is worth having. He asked Walter about the northwest corner drainage when the spring was wet. He asked about the tile under the south field. He asked about the Oliver 1855's hydraulic system cold morning sequence, because the 1855 was the machine he should have kept in 1978 and had not kept, and he was now running a different machine that had its own characteristics he was learning, and the comparison with Harold's machine helped him think about what he was looking for in the one he had. Walter told him everything he asked, without reservation, without the withholding that might have characterized a relationship where the history of the 1978 conversation and the 1982 rescue was present as an unspoken ledger. The history was present, but it was not a ledger. It was the shared history of two men who had grown up on the same land under the same father and who were now, in their 40s, farming adjacent sections of that land and building what Harold had hoped they would build. Not identical operations, not mirror images, but two working farms on Darke County ground that both continued. The equipment fund note between them was paid off by 1989. 7 years of Dennis's farm income directed at the balance. The payments made without fail because they were to his brother rather than to a bank, and because a debt to his brother was the debt he was least willing to be laid on. When the final payment was made, Walter had said nothing ceremonial. He had said good, and had gone back to what he was doing. The Fenner farms, both of them, the Walter operation and the Dennis operation, were still producing Darke County corn and soybeans in the 1990s. Walter's son came into the operation in 1991 when he was 22 and began the learning that Walter had done alongside Harold and that Harold had done alongside his own father. The embodied, accumulated, specifically located knowledge of ground that has been farmed by people who paid careful attention across multiple generations. Dennis's operation continued under Dennis's own management, more conservative than it had been before 1982. The discipline of the restructuring having produced a permanent shift in how he thought about the relationship between income and obligation. They were different farmers. They had always been different. Harold had known this and had worried about it, and had been unable to fully address it in the 2 years of kitchen conversations before he died. because the knowledge he most wanted to transfer, the specific practiced accumulated knowledge of the land and the machinery and the seasons, was not fully transferable through conversation to a son who had been away from it for 20 years. What Harold had not anticipated was that the transfer would happen differently, not from father to sons in the years before the death, but from son to son in the years after it. In the February evening in the equipment barn, when Walter set down the wrench and said, "Tell me what's happening," and in all the visits and conversations and practical assists that followed that evening across the next decade. The knowledge had found its path. It had taken a different route than Harold had planned, but it had arrived. Both farms survived. Harold had wanted both farms to survive. He had built a son who knew that, and who had the equipment fund balance available when the knowing needed to be expressed in a way that was more than conversation. The Oliver 1855 was still running in 1992, 21 years after Harold had bought it, used in 1971. Walter's son drove it on the lighter field work, the disking and the lighter cultivation runs that the primary tractor was too large for efficiently. The machine that Harold had maintained and that Walter had maintained was now being maintained by the third generation of the Fenner family on the same Darke County ground where Harold had farmed it. It was not a restored machine. It was a working machine in working condition, the condition produced by the specific habit of attention that Harold had established and that had passed through Walter to Walter's son in the form that practical knowledge passes, through presence, through demonstration, through the shared work of maintenance done correctly across enough seasons that the method becomes the only method you know. The Merrill consulting firm had closed its West Central Ohio agricultural practice in 1984, after the farm crisis had revealed the structural weakness of the leveraged expansion model the firm had been recommending in the late 1970s. Merrill himself had moved to a different line of work. The quarterly reports he had produced for Dennis's operation were in the farm office filing cabinet, organized by year, available to be read and compared against the outcomes they had projected. Dennis had read them once in 1985 and had not read them again. The projections had been made honestly, from the data that was available in 1978, under assumptions that the late 1970s had made seem reasonable. The assumptions had been wrong. The wrongness had not been dishonest. It had been the specific failure of expertise that does not know what it does not know, which is the failure that all expertise is subject to, and that is most costly when the subject is a complex system operating in conditions that can change in ways the expertise did not model. What Walter had known that Merrill had not was simpler and more durable than any model. He had known what Harold had done and why Harold had done it. He had known it not from the quarterly reports and the expansion projections and the leveraged acquisition strategy, but from 20 years of working alongside a man who had built something by doing the same things correctly for 40 years. The knowledge was not sophisticated. It was specific, and it was repeated, and it was embodied in the particular way that knowledge is embodied when you learn it by doing it rather than by being told it. Harold had known this distinction and had tried, in his final 2 years, to give both sons what he could give through conversation. He had succeeded with the son who was already farming. He had given the other son the principles without the practice, and the principles without the practice were not enough when the conditions changed in 1980, and the gap between what the model said and what the land could actually produce became the gap that determined whether the farm survived. The farm survived because Walter still had the equipment fund. The equipment fund survived because Harold had built it and Walter had maintained it. Walter had maintained it because Harold had explained, in the kitchen in the evenings in the years before he died, what the fund was for and why it existed and how it had been the difference, across 41 years of Darke County farming, between the Fenner operation and the operations around them that had not made it through the difficult years. One of the sons had heard that and understood it from the inside, from 20 years of watching it operate. The other son had heard it and understood it from the outside, from description alone, and the description had not been enough. The equipment fund had been enough. Harold Fenner had built it across 30 years for reasons he could not fully anticipate, the way all the best preparations are built, for the general case, against the unknown specific, in the knowledge that what the future required could not be predicted, but that the preparation could be made available for whatever it required. What it had required in February of 1982 was a brother with a wrench in a warm equipment barn who set the wrench down and said, "Tell me what's happening." The preparation was there. Both farms continued. That was what Harold had wanted. That was what the equipment fund had made possible. That was enough. The specific character of Harold Fenner's farming knowledge, the knowledge he spent 2 years trying to pass to both sons before he died in March of 1978, was not the kind that appears in Extension Service publications or in the farm management textbooks that programs like the one Merrill had attended at Ohio State required students to read. It was older than those sources and more specific than those sources, and its age and specificity were the qualities that made it durable in a way that the more recent and more general knowledge was not. Harold had learned to farm from his own father, who had farmed the original 80 Darke County acres from 1913 until he died in 1937. 24 years of learning a specific parcel of specific ground in a specific county in a specific climate, and the knowledge produced by 24 years of that kind of attention was not the knowledge you could generate from reading about Darke County. It was the knowledge you could only generate from being there, from watching what happened in the wet springs and the dry Augusts, from understanding how the southeast corner drained versus the northwest corner, from knowing which fence line ran along a soil-type boundary that changed how you managed the two sides of it. Harold had inherited this knowledge when he took over the operation in 1937, in the specific form that practical knowledge transfers, through the years of working alongside his father before his father died, through the embodied accumulation of shared experience that meant Harold already knew most of what he needed to know when he became the sole operator. He had added to it across his own 41 years of farming, extending the base his father had built with his own observation and his own seasons and his own decisions about what worked and what didn't. By 1978, when Harold died, the knowledge he carried was 65 years old in its foundation and had been extended and refined across 4 decades of his own farming. It was specific to 320 acres of Darke County soil. It was not written down except in the farm records, the yield books and the equipment logs and the field maps that Harold had maintained in the filing cabinet in the farm office. And it existed in a form that could be transmitted only imperfectly through conversation and completely only through the years of working alongside someone who carried it. Walter had gotten the complete version because he had been working alongside Harold for 20 years before Harold died. Dennis had gotten the conversation version because he had been away for 20 years. And the conversation version was a true rendering of what Harold knew, but was not the same thing as knowing it. The way a description of a sound is not the same thing as hearing it. This was the gap that Harold could not close in 2 years of kitchen evenings, and that had defined the difference in outcomes between his 2 sons across the decade that followed his death. The Van Buren expansion that Dennis undertook in 1978 was not obviously wrong at the moment it was made. The Merrill assessment was not dishonest, and the projections were built from real data with real methodology. What the assessment could not account for was the specific local knowledge that Walter had and Dennis did not about the projections, which were about commodity prices and interest rates, and neither son could predict those, but about the ground. The Van Buren ground that Dennis added was not the Fenner ground. It was different soil, different drainage, different history, and the management of it required specific knowledge that Dennis was still in the process of building when the conditions changed in 1980 and left no margin for the learning period. Walter had walked the Van Buren ground alongside Harold on 2 separate occasions in the late 1960s, when Harold had considered buying it before deciding the price was too high for what the ground was. Harold had said, on both occasions, that the Van Buren ground was capable, but that the drainage on the east side was inconsistent. Some years it drained well, and some years it held water past planting in a way that cost yield on the late planted acres. He had said the inconsistency made the ground a risk for a note-funded acquisition where the note payment was fixed and the yield was not. Walter had remembered this. Dennis had not heard it, because it had been said on 2 walks that happened when Dennis was in Dayton building his engineering career, and that had not been part of the kitchen evening conversations that Harold directed at both sons equally. When the Van Buren's east side held water in the wet spring of 1981 and pushed the planting date past optimal and reduced the corn yield on those acres, by an amount that further squeezed the cash flow that the interest rate environment had already squeezed beyond what the operation could service without drawing on reserves. The yield loss was the specific result of the drainage inconsistency that Harold had identified on 2 walks in the late 1960s, and that had been recorded not in any document Dennis could read, but in Walter's working memory. Dennis had not known about the drainage. Merrill had not known about it either. The Merrill assessment had used county soil maps and regional drainage records that showed the Van Buren ground as adequate, which it was in normal years, and had not shown the specific inconsistency that Harold's direct observation across 2 decades of watching the adjacent ground had revealed. This was the failure of the general expertise against the specific knowledge. The county soil maps were accurate as county soil maps. The regional drainage records were accurate as regional drainage records. Neither captured what 40 years of watching a specific parcel in specific weather conditions had captured, which was the specific behavior of the Van Buren east side in wet springs, and specifically how wet a spring had to be before the east side held water past planting date, and specifically how much yield the late planting cost. Harold knew this. Walter knew it because Harold had told him on 2 walks in the late 1960s, and because Walter's memory of things Harold said was the memory of a man who had treated his father's specific knowledge as a resource rather than as background. Dennis did not know it because he had not been there. The gap between knowing it and not knowing it was the gap between the 2 farming operations across the decade from 1978 to 1988. There was a moment in the spring of 1979, between the Van Buren purchase and the beginning of the crisis, when Dennis had walked his east fields after a moderately wet March and had noticed that the drainage on the east side was slower than he expected. He had noted it without knowing what to make of it. It was one wet spring. The drainage was slow but not catastrophic, and the planting date was not significantly affected. He had filed the observation without connecting it to anything because he didn't have the context that would have made it significant. The context being Harold's 2 walks in the late 1960s and the specific assessment Harold had made on those walks about what the east side did in wet springs. He had mentioned it to Merrill at the quarterly review in June of 1979. Merrill had said the county soil map showed adequate drainage for that section, and that one slow drainage spring was probably weather-related rather than structural. This was a reasonable response from someone working from county-level data. It was the wrong response from someone with Harold's specific local knowledge, but Merrill did not have Harold's knowledge, and Dennis did not know that the knowledge Merrill lacked was available elsewhere. If Dennis had driven to Walter's farm in the spring of 1979 and had described the slow east side drainage and had asked what Walter knew about it, Walter would have told him what Harold had said on those 2 walks in the late 1960s. He would have told Dennis that the slow drainage was not weather-related, that it was a structural characteristic of the east side's subsoil permeability that Harold had identified as a risk factor for note-funded acquisition in wet years. He would have told Dennis that the drainage inconsistency needed to be accounted for in the cash flow projections, that the yield projections needed a wet year scenario that included the east side drainage problem, not just an average year scenario that assumed normal drainage. If the projections had included that scenario, the note structure Dennis agreed to in 1978 would have looked different. The margin of safety required to carry the note through a bad year, a wet spring in combination with soft commodity prices and rising interest rates, would have been larger. The margin of safety available from the operation's income, which was fixed at the scale Dennis was farming, would not have supported a larger margin. The arithmetic would have said the Van Buren note was more risk than the operation could comfortably carry, and Dennis, who was a capable engineer with a genuine respect for arithmetic, would have heard that. He might still have signed the note. The late 1970s agricultural optimism was pervasive and persuasive, and one man's caution about one field's drainage in wet years might not have been enough to overcome the general direction of the environment, but he would have heard it. He had not heard it because he had not asked. He had retained the professional management and had not asked his brother, and the professional management had not known what his brother knew, and what his brother knew was the specific thing that mattered when the conditions changed. Walter, on his side, had not offered what Dennis had not asked for, which was the correct decision in a relationship between adult brothers, where one has made a choice and the other disagrees. You offer once. Walter had offered once in the spring of 1978, and Dennis had said he was handling the business side himself, and that had been the end of what could be appropriately offered. He had offered the equipment fund in 1982 without being asked, which was different. That was not offering advice. That was offering resources when resources were what the situation required. The distinction mattered to Walter, and he had thought about it clearly before he drove to the bank with the equipment fund balance. Advice offered twice to someone who has declined it once is a statement about the advisor's judgment. Resources offered when they are the specific thing needed is a statement about the relationship. He was interested in the relationship. The relationship had survived the decade of divergent outcomes intact because both men understood it correctly. Dennis understood that Walter had been right about the risks of the Van Buren note and did not pretend otherwise after the restructuring. Walter understood that Dennis had made a decision in good faith from the information and guidance available to him, and that the outcome of a decision made in good faith from limited information was not a moral failure. The respect went both directions, and the respect was what had allowed the February 1982 conversation to happen. Dennis saying he needed to talk, Walter setting down the wrench and saying, "Tell me what's happening." Harold, in the kitchen evenings before he died, had told both sons what the farm was and what it had taken to build it. He had not been able to give both sons the complete understanding of what he was saying, but he had given Walter the working knowledge and the equipment fund, and he had given Dennis the relationship with Walter, and in the end the relationship had conveyed what the conversation alone had not been able to. Not through talk, but through the specific gesture of a man setting down a wrench in a warm equipment barn and listening without reservation to his brother's honest account of a difficulty that needed two people to address. That was the transmission that Harold had not been able to engineer, and that had happened anyway, in the way of transmissions that happen when two people decide that the relationship is more important than the record of who was right. Both farms continued. Harold had built sons capable of that. The land was still the land. The machines were still working. The knowledge continued forward. That was what Harold Fenner had actually left his sons, beyond the 320 acres and the equipment fund and the Oliver 1855 that ran in 1992 on the same Darke County ground where Harold had bought it used in 1971. He had left two sons who, in the end, understood what the farm was for. The farm was not for proving yourself. The farm was not for growing beyond what the income supported. The farm was for farming, the next year and the year after, the same ground that had been farmed before you, and that would be farmed after you. The continuity of attention across the seasons, being the whole purpose and the whole product and the whole inheritance. One son had understood this from working alongside his father for 20 years. The other had come to understand it from the harder path of a crisis survived with his brother's help and the 30 years of farming that followed. Both had arrived at the same understanding. Both farms continued. Harold had wanted both farms to continue. That was what it had taken. That was enough. The farming community of Darke County that observed the two Fenner operations through the late 1970s and early 1980s had, as farming communities do, its own running assessment of what was happening and why. The assessment evolved across the decade in the way that community assessments evolve, shaped by visible events, by the stories that traveled through the elevator and the extension meetings and the county fair, by the comparison between what people had predicted and what had actually occurred. In the late 1970s, the assessment had favored Dennis. He was the brother who was moving, adding ground, upgrading equipment, retaining professional management, operating in the spirit of the era's agricultural optimism that said scale and professionalization were the direction of the successful farm operation. Walter was the brother who was standing still, maintaining Harold's equipment, farming Harold's 160 acres at Harold's scale, not expanding, not modernizing in the ways the era rewarded. The community's read of the two operations in 1979 was that Dennis had the trajectory and Walter had the stability, and trajectory was the quality the late 1970s were celebrating. The community's read changed through 1981 and 1982 as the farm crisis revealed the cost of the trajectory. It did not change all at once. It changed the way that understanding changes when the evidence accumulates past the point where the previous understanding can accommodate it, gradually at first, then completely. The operations in the county that had borrowed to expand in the late 1970s were, by 1982, occupying the specific and visible situations that the crisis had produced for them. The restructuring meetings with agricultural lending officers, the FDIC letters for the ones whose banks had failed, the for sale signs on the parcels that had to be liquidated to service the debt that could no longer be serviced from income. Dennis's operation was not in the most visible of these situations. The restructuring had happened before the situation reached the stage of forced sale or foreclosure, but it was visible enough to the people who knew both brothers that the narrative of the decade had shifted. The brother who had been standing still was the brother who was still farming unchanged. The brother who had been moving was the brother who had needed his standing still brother's equipment fund to keep the operation together. The community did not say this unkindly. Most of the community that had watched both operations through the decade understood by 1982 that the difference between the two trajectories was not primarily a difference in farming ability or in character. It was a difference in information, specifically in the information that Harold's 41 years of specific local knowledge represented, and in how much of that information each son had been able to absorb before Harold died. This understanding was not universal. There were people in the county who drew simpler conclusions, who said that Dennis had been foolish and Walter had been smart, or that the consultant was to blame, or that anyone could have seen the interest rate risk in 1978 if they had been paying attention. These simpler conclusions were easier to hold and easier to express at the elevator or the fair, and simpler conclusions travel faster in farming communities than complicated ones. But the farmers who had known Harold well, who had farmed adjacent ground for years, and who had watched Harold build his operation through the lean years of the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s with the patient, debt-free, equipment fund approach, understood that what Dennis had failed to carry forward was not primarily the financial discipline, which Merrill's projections had appeared to support anyway. What Dennis had failed to carry forward was the specific local knowledge that Harold's 41 years had accumulated about the specific ground he was farming, and specifically about the Van Buren ground that had been too expensive in Harold's judgment in the late 1960s for reasons that included the east side drainage problem. One of these farmers, a man named Alderdice, who had farmed the ground north of the Fenner property for 30 years, and who had watched Harold farm from the perspective of a neighbor who understood the decisions Harold was making, because he was making similar decisions on his own operation, had said, at the extension meeting in the fall of 1982, where the farm crisis was being discussed in the context of what lessons could be drawn from it, Harold Fenner knew things about the ground he farmed that took 40 years to learn. He tried to give both boys what he knew, but 40 years doesn't fit into 2 years of kitchen table conversations, even good ones. Several men in the meeting had nodded at this. Alderdice had continued. The boy who stayed knew it from working alongside his father. The boy who left knew it from what his father told him. What you know from working alongside is different from what you know from being told. It doesn't mean either boy was wrong. It means farming knowledge has a specific way of transmitting, and that way takes time. And 2 years wasn't enough time for the transmission to complete. This was as precise a statement of what had happened as any that was made in the Darke County farming community in those years, and it was made by a man who had learned similar things alongside his own father, and who was in the process of transmitting them to his own son through the same slow, embodied, presence-required method. The Oliver 1855 that Harold had bought used in 1971, and that Walter had maintained through the 1980s, and that Walter's son was driving in the early 1990s, was, by 1992, 21 years into the Fenner family's ownership and operating correctly. The machine had required across those 21 years the standard cycle of maintenance items that a well-maintained diesel tractor of its era required: injector rebuilds at intervals, hydraulic pump work in the mid-1980s, a clutch rebuild in 1987 that had been the most significant single repair cost in the machine's time with the family. The cumulative maintenance cost across 21 years was a specific number in the equipment fund ledger, alongside the original purchase price and the annual fuel and service entries. The cumulative cost was less, per acre worked, than the depreciation on the new equipment that Dennis had bought in 1978 to match the scale of the Van Buren expansion. even without accounting for the interest on the note that had financed the new equipment. The comparison was not the point exactly. Harold had not maintained the 1855 as a financial strategy. He had maintained it because maintaining it was correct practice, and correct practice was what he did. But the comparison existed, and the ledger recorded it, and anyone who wanted to understand the relationship between Harold's approach and the operation's survival across 4 decades of different conditions could read the relationship in the ledger. Walter had shown the ledger to Dennis in 1983, the year after the restructuring, not as a demonstration of the correctness of Harold's approach, but as a practical accounting that Dennis needed to understand in order to manage his own operation going forward without the professional management that had proven inadequate to the specific local conditions. Dennis had sat with the ledger for a long time. He had asked questions about specific entries, why a particular repair had been approached one way rather than another, what the diagnostic sequence had been that identified the problem before it became a larger problem, how the equipment fund balance had been managed through the years when the fund had been called on for a repair and needed rebuilding afterward. Walter had answered each question. He was not teaching Dennis to farm. Dennis knew how to farm in the general sense that he had grown up on this ground and had worked it in his teenage years and had farmed it himself for the years since Harold died. What he was teaching Dennis was the specific application of Harold's method to the specific equipment that Dennis was now running, and the specific characteristics of the specific fields that Dennis was now managing, and the specific soil behavior that Harold had observed and recorded and transmitted to Walter across 20 years of working alongside, and that Walter was now transmitting to Dennis across the neighbor visits and the equipment barn conversations that had become the ordinary texture of their relationship. The transmission was happening. It was happening late, 10 years after Harold had hoped it would happen, through a route Harold had not anticipated, by means of a crisis that neither brother would have chosen as the mechanism. But it was happening, and the knowledge that Harold had accumulated across 41 years and that had been fully transmitted to one son and partially transmitted to the other was now moving through the relationship between the 2 sons in the way that all practical knowledge moves, through doing alongside, through asking and answering, through the accumulated presence of 2 people working in the same place and paying attention to the same things over enough time for the knowledge to pass between them completely. Dennis Fenner was a better farmer in 1990 than he had been in 1978, and not primarily because of experience in the general sense, but because of specific knowledge that had been available to him since 1978 and that he had not known to ask for. When he began asking, Walter had given it without reservation. The giving and the asking had been the relationship Harold had hoped for in the kitchen evenings, in the specific conversations about the northwest corner drainage and the tile under the south field, and the equipment fund, and the machinery dealer in Greenville who was honest. He had hoped the relationship between his sons would transmit what conversation alone could not. It had. Not in the form he anticipated. In the form that was available, which was the only form that mattered. Both farms continued into the next decade and into the one after that. The Darke County ground that Harold Fenner had assembled across 41 years was still producing corn and soybeans in the 21st century, under the management of the generation after Walter and Dennis. The knowledge accumulated across 3 generations of careful attention, continuing to inform decisions that were made on the same specific soil in the same specific county that Harold's father had farmed before Harold and that Harold had farmed before his sons. The Oliver 1855 eventually retired from the Fenner operation in the mid-1990s, replaced at last by a machine whose economics were more favorable than the old tractors. Walter kept it in the barn for several years before selling it to a neighbor who wanted a reliable utility tractor for lighter work. It left the Fenner yard in the way that working machines leave when they have given what they have to give, without ceremony, in the ordinary transaction of equipment that has been used well and maintained well, and that retains enough value at the end of its working life with one operator to be useful at the beginning of its working life with another. The equipment fund continued. Harold had started it, Walter had maintained it, and Walter's son was maintaining it in the form Harold had established. A separate account, funded from crop income at the proportion Harold had specified, available only for equipment and for nothing else. The balance moved up and down as equipment was bought and maintained and occasionally sold, but the fund itself was permanent. The same way the practice of maintaining it was permanent. Not because anyone had declared it permanent, but because it had been correct to maintain it through every year of the operation, and because things that are correct do not require a declared permanence to continue. Harold Fenner had died in March of 1978 with 2 sons and 320 acres of Darke County farmland. He had worried in the 2 years before his death about whether both sons would be able to keep what he was leaving them. He had done what he could in the kitchen evenings, and had hoped the rest would find a way. The rest had found a way, not through the form he had planned, through the form that was available. The farms continued. That was what he had wanted. That was what the equipment fund and the knowledge and the relationship between his sons had together made possible. That was enough.